Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today we're on the Battle for Azeroth beta, gonna be discussing the top 5 problems that are gonna be major issues coming into the new expansions for Frost DKs. Now, if you're wondering where I get these opinions from and why I believe these are gonna be major issues, I've had to level up a Frost DK twice now to 120 and get some of that sweet mythic / heroic loot that's going on right now. I mean, we can't miss out on that. So let's go ahead and jump into this video and just start talking about these major issues.
But it's alright, 'cause right now we're frozen.
I wanna forget mistakes that helped me make. It's better to be broken than to break.
I asked in the last video what you guys wanted changed about DKs, both Frost and Unholy, and we really got some varying opinions about the majority of specs. I mean, mainly Frost DK, we see it's mainly the people on the channel. We just want two-handed Frost DK swords back. I mean, that's kind of expected. The comments were everywhere. With Unholy, it was a little bit different. There were some opinions about mechanical stability and about major cooldowns. Now, obviously, on both sides of the board, people want Breath of Sindragosa back and Apocalypse back to kind of make up for some of the major issues with DKs at the moment. Now, one of the things I believe is Frost DK needs a lot more help than Unholy DK, and in this video I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about it on why I believe that. Starting off with number 5 major problem with Frost DKs in Battle for Azeroth is going to be the elimination of legendary items. Now, my personal opinion about legendary items is I haven't liked them. At the beginning, I was like, cool, we're going to get some legendary shiny items. Let's go for this, push out some DPS, but that wasn't my fairy tale. I ended up getting the worst legendaries you could get, and I didn't end up getting the best ones until nearly the end of the expansion, where somehow I managed to raise up to the top 100 Frost DKs on Illidan fairly fast. It took me less than a month, and that was going from being struggling in Mythic Pluses to dominating Mythic Pluses just with a simple change of a legendary. So it kind of changed my whole outlook on whether or not I really enjoyed legendaries. But regardless of that fact, it's going to affect us currently quite a bit in Battle for Azeroth. So let me talk about this a little bit more. Going into, I'd say, specifics like the legendary Torvon's bindings, which is the legendary bracers that when using our major cooldowns such as Pillar of Frost, the bindings increased our frost damage by 15%. Now you got to realize a lot of classes were balanced around their legendary items. Some classes like Warlocks, even though they're best in slots, didn't nearly affect their DPS in the rotation, as let's say 15% frost DK on a 15% frost damage on a frost DK. You could tell right away how that's going to be a major problem transitioning into Battle for Azeroth, because once you take out the legendary items, we're down 15% frost damage, which actually turns out to be a huge amount of damage in both burst and consistency, mainly burst obviously, since it only applies when Pillar of Frost is up. Now, why is this going to be a major problem for us? We're missing a ton of our damage. A ton of damage that we're supposed to have right off the bat is going to disappear as soon as we hit level 116 and we outlevel our legendary items. And before that actually happened, my DPS was a lot more balanced as a Frost DK inside of a lot of the dungeons, leveling up when things weren't scaling up to 120 in dungeons. At 110, everything looked better with the legendary items because it was still being balanced off that original Legion scaling. But once you take away that 15%, it definitely affected my DPS overall as I progressed up through the levels, hit level 116, hit level 120, started doing heroic dungeons and mythic dungeons. I started to notice that as a Frost DK, I was falling behind in damage quite often. Now don't compare a Frost DK's damage to things right now such as a rogue, a hunter, or a frost mage, which they all have extreme DPS in certain situations. But overall, Frost DKs are definitely falling behind and not scaling as well as other classes, just based on the fact that we've lost legendaries that accounted for over 15% of our DPS on either a major burst or things along those lines. And the fact that we lost Breath of Sindragosa nerfs down our single target even more. And one of the major issues that I've noticed just just the fact of removing some of those legendary items is the majority of our legendary items affected us mechanically quite a bit. As for a lot of other classes that either increased raw damage or things like that, those can be simply fixed by tweaking up damage priority or just simply tweaking up how much damage certain talents or abilities do. Now, one of the things that I've noticed with Frost DKs is a lot of the talents in different situations will increase just slightly, not much, a little bit better than the other one. And the only way to increase your single target by a vast amount is to go like full burst spec, but obviously in a Mythic Plus situation where you're going to be cleaving a lot of adds over and over again, that's not going to end up very well. So you can actually hit fairly good peaks as a Frost DK, but it absolutely destroys your consistency damage inside of higher level mythics and things like that. Or you could choose to have a lot of single target burst using your breath spec, but that's also going to kill a lot of your consistent rotation going on with your abilities. Now that's going to sum it up, I'd say, for the legendary discussion on taking those away. I believe legendaries are hurting Frost DKs, removing those a lot more than other classes, just for the simple fact that it really affected our rotation by a lot. It was a mechanical downgrade from where we currently were, and they've taken the basically Frost DKs, taken away legendaries and stat squished us, and it kind of makes it a little bit harder to see in comparison if they would have done that let's say in Legion. But overall, it's hurting us a lot more than it's hurting other classes, just based on how powerful our legendaries were. So let's move on to the next reason. Let's go over the fourth major problem with Frost DKs heading into Battle for Azeroth after Legion, and that's going to be the elimination of 2 sets and 4 sets on your raid gear heading into the new expansion. Now you're probably wondering, why does this really affect me too much on a Frost DK when it comes to DPS? If you like doing high level mythic pluses, you like doing normal, heroic, or mythic rating, you're obviously going to understand the importance of 2 sets to 4 sets, which within Legion, the 2 set or 4 set of any current raid was actually what was deciding what build we were running, since the majority of specs were pretty equal when it came to either single target or AoE DPS. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up our current raid tier that we're using in Antor's The Burning Throne. As you can see there, it increases Howling Blast damage and increases Obliterate damage by 15%. And that also delegated what relics we'd be using, obviously increasing our Obliterate main hand and offhand damage and our Frost Strike main hand and offhand damage to deal the best overall consistency we could. And that also changed up our talents from using Runic Attune over to Shattering Strikes, since we used Obliterates and Howling Blasts over Frost Strikes to deal quite a bit of damage. And once in a while we dump out the 5 stacks of Shattering Strikes to deal the majority of Frost Strike damage on the target. Now that we could see this same, not necessarily the same pattern, but we could see the same thing going on with the majority of any raids happening within Legion. Now if we look back towards Tomb of Sargeras, now the tier gear here, every 60 runic power is spent while Pillar of Frost is activated, increase the duration of Pillar of Frost by 10 seconds, obviously giving way to the elongated spec that people switched over to after the raid before, delegating again what talents we were using for the current expansion or the current fight there. Now the major issue that's going to be going on with this is our class was balanced around these 2 and 4 sets, considering how powerful they are. If you take a Frost DK in current Legion again and stat squish the heck out of him, take away that 4 set, it's going to put us at a complete disadvantage compared to other classes that didn't really rely on the 2 or 4 set nearly as much as Frost DKs, especially seeing that the majority of the changes that we got throughout Legion was definitely mechanical until we got to the ending raid, and instead of being more mechanical buffs, they decided to over buff us in pure damage, giving us 15% Obliterate and Howling Blast damage and granting us an icy pillar that comes up out of nowhere and just shoots at the target, nails it, dealing extreme damage to make up for the lack of overall mechanical stability, which that overall mechanical stability is what we're now facing heading into Battle for Azeroth, which is going to put us behind other classes, and mechanically we're not going to be able to scale as well as other classes just for this simple reason. And you know, cutting out the 4 set, cutting out the legendary bracers, we're back to this area where all the specs deal roughly around the same consistency. You could go breath for a little bit more single target burst, but overall none of them really shine. They're just kind of, it feels kind of bland to me, I guess you could say, within the PvE consistency specs. I feel like there needs to be a little bit more oomph there. We're missing a talent, maybe like a Breath of Sindragosa talent. Maybe put that on a reduced cooldown and decrease the damage a little bit so we have a little bit harder opener, since we are like the slowest class in the game. And not only that, we have to do some other things, which we'll talk about very soon in this video, that reduces our damage by quite a bit. The third major problem for Frost DKs in Battle for Azeroth is going to be when we were actually changed and revamped in Legion. Now you got to remember, Legion was kind of the first expansion where the game went from major global cooldowns to playing the game more like Street Fighter. And the reason why global cooldowns are going to put us at a pretty large disadvantage is now we have to spend 2 to 3 seconds pre-popping things before we go into combat, before we can actually deal roughly the same amount of DPS as other classes. I personally find it very annoying having to pop obliteration on a global cooldown in PvE situations. And if you want my personal opinion about global cooldowns, as a PvPer, I definitely like seeing that implemented into the game. I like seeing a little bit more chess play instead of Street Fighter and PvP. But as far as PvE goes, I do find the GCD change definitely frustrating from the point of view of a Mythic Raider or a Mythic Plus player. I definitely don't like that on the PvE standpoint. But overall, the reason why this is going to be a major problem for Frost DKs is Frost DKs were designed in Legion to not have global cooldowns. And when you take a baseline Frost DK and from Legion that's designed to be very fluent and deal a lot of DPS, and then you just add in a bunch of clunkiness afterwards, it's not really going to end up to be very well. I mean, you could say that with a lot of classes going into Battle for Azeroth, but with Frost DKs, it's really hurt my damage quite a bit when it came to Mythics. Just obliteration alone being on a global cooldown hurts our damage by a lot. It actually hurts the entire ability. It almost makes it not worth using in AoE situations and taking a completely different route, being that you may be able to perk quite a bit of burst damage using obliteration. The major issue that you're going to run into is spamming 3 frost strikes, or 3 frost strikes, that is a tongue twister, 3 frost scythes is going to be quite a bit, the majority of the time is going to be quite a bit more damage than using a frost scythe, using a frost strike, and then trying to go back again to using that frost scythe. Now you remember you had to throw in the global cooldown of popping obliteration in there too, so spamming 3 frost scythes in a row and hopefully granting you a howling blast proc is going to give you more DPS than popping obliteration and using frost scythes and trying to guarantee your crit for those frost scythes. So it took obliteration, which used to be like the leading AoE talent for Frost DKs, and it just plummeted it into the ground. It completely destroyed the rotation of obliteration. Now that's something I've been analyzing for quite some time, and I've even had people point out in videos saying you're not using that talent correctly. Well, that's the problem. This talent doesn't work correctly anymore with the way they've balanced it out. Now this talent, I believe, needs to be off the global cooldown. That one shouldn't be on there, otherwise it completely destroys how that talent works. It completely messed it up. I absolutely hate using obliteration now. I keep thinking, man, it should be good, but it's really not, because just spamming overall frost strikes and trying to get a howling blast proc gives me more DPS than actually trying to use the ability correctly, which really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So as you can see why that ends up being a major problem heading into Battle for Azeroth from Legion for Frost DKs. The second major problem that we're going to be discussing right now in Frost DKs in Battle for Azeroth is talents alone, having to choose between AoE and single target. Now this wasn't nearly as big of a problem in Legion, since we kind of had a base overall DPS that was added to with legendaries and force sets, which created kind of a cushion for us, a cushion for Frost DKs, that we don't fall below a certain bar in DPS regarding, I mean, really any spec we play. It was ending up to be fairly balanced. Now in Battle for Azeroth, it's not nearly like that, because choosing between specs is making our DPS go like this. It's like rolling damage from now on that we got to choose between. Do we want single target or do we want AoE? So you can generate a lot of AoE burst damage by taking Avalanche and Freezing Fog, but that's going to absolutely destroy a lot of your single target damage based on Horn of Winter. Now the reduction of cooldown used to be a really good thing in Legion, but obviously with the elimination of a lot of our off stats based on leveling to 120, our overall consistency isn't going to be nearly as good as relying on a lot of major burst talents to deal AoE pressure and things along those lines. So it's kind of like, do you want single target by taking Horn of Winter, or do you want AoE by taking Freezing Fog? And now not taking Horn of Winter is going to affect your Breath of Sindragosa damage by quite a lot, but obviously not taking Freezing Fog is going to affect your AoE in AoE situations by obviously quite a lot, since Howling Blast is actually our largest damaging ability, which is one of the problems that's making Obliteration complete garbage inside PvE situations. And as for like the level 100 talents, as you saw, you could take Breath of Sindragosa for that AoE, or you can take Obliteration for that consistent PvE, which it really isn't that great because of the global cooldown change. I personally, my favorite's Breath of Sindragosa, but the only way that you can use this ability to be viable is to completely have Empowered Rune Weapon and of course Horn of Winter up, lined up with your cooldowns at that current time, because if you use Breath of Sindragosa outside of Pillar of Frost, it ends up not being that great. So Frost Decays end up being extremely clunky when having to run cooldowns this way, but at least since you're not running Ice Cap, you can get a fairly good timer on your Pillar of Frost to Breath of Sindragosa. But overall, you really have to choose between, do you want AoE or do you want consistency? It's not like it's an equal balance to you know, you lose a little bit of burst. Here's the DPS bar. Your AoE goes down if you spec out of Freezing Fog, but your single target goes up. I mean, let's say this is the bar. This is where all the DPS are. This is the bar, just normal DPS, casual DPS. Let's say it's around, you know, let's say it's about 600-700k for a normal DPS at the moment, overall DPS. Let's just put it that way. If you spec out of your AoE, your overall DPS on a Frost Decay drops really low, but your boss damage goes up really high. Now, if you spec in a Freezing Fog, your AoE damage goes through the roof, while your boss damage again goes through the floor. Really saying, like, what do you want? You want AoE or do you want consistency? While a lot of other classes just have both off of their basic build, and that's really going to be affecting Frost Decays quite a lot. So I am interested to see what they're planning on changes heading into Battle for Azeroth, because I really feel like there needs to be quite a bit of changes based on a lot of these facts moving into the new expansion. And the largest major problem with Frost Decays heading into Battle for Azeroth is we don't have our two-handers yet. Obviously, that is the biggest problem we got going on right now. Okay, so jokes aside, even though I would love to see Frost Decay two-handers back, come on guys, give us the two-handers back. I'm going to go ahead and focus more on constructive criticism at the current expansion than kind of going off course and putting up signs saying we need two-handers at the moment. I'm going to have to say it's how slow we are. Now, obviously, with the character class of Frost Decays being slow-moving targets and dealing high amounts of burst damage with single attacks, which would match a Frost Decay with a two-hander really well, but I don't know what I'm talking about with that one, obviously, because you think you do, but you don't. Okay, so talking about how slow Frost Decays are at the moment, I've also talked about how much prep time it takes to actually deal the same amount of damage as a lot of other classes. You have to pre-pop Pillar of Frost, and if you want Obliteration to be minorly effective in a PvE situation, you also have to pop that outside of combat, which also happens to waste an extra second of your Pillar of Frost. And then you could go into using Remorseless Wind to Obliterate if you're running the AoE Obliterate spec, or you can go ahead and start spamming those Frost Scythes and granting those Howling Blast procs. Hopefully you get a Howling Blast proc off of Frost Scythe, otherwise it's most likely going to be a damage nerf compared to just spamming 3 Frost Scythe and having a greater chance of getting that Howling Blast proc, which is just all confusing in its own mind. I don't understand why they decided to balance that talent that way, but obviously being slow is a huge problem in terms of trying to compete with other DPS, because by the time that I'm heading towards the next mob, or I'm heading towards or getting to the next mob, a lot of classes are already there and DPSing, and instead of actually competing with the other classes at the start of the poll like I would like to be doing, I'm playing catch up a good 90% of the time, unless I have Wraith Walk Up, which is a 45-second cooldown. You could have it up for, I'd say, every third pull or so, maybe more like 80% of the time. But the most of the time, I'm just playing catch up. Like, if there's a hunter in the group, there's no way I'm going to hit the next mobs before the hunter. If there's a rogue in the group, there's no way I'm going to get to those mobs before the rogue. And instead of doing, 10k DPS or 11k DPS like my DPS should be telling me that I'm doing, it's saying I'm only doing 5 to 6k DPS just based on the fact that I couldn't reach the targets in time. Really annoying for a Frost DK, I'm not gonna lie. And obviously in higher level mythic pluses and things along that line, it'll be it'll probably be a bit better, since they might wait a couple seconds to pull until you're able to hit the target. Maybe they won't, who knows. But in turn, it ends up being very hard for a Frost DK to deal the same amount of pressure as other classes, just based on the fact that it takes us so long to go from target A to target B inside of dungeon situations, and that's really going to affect our DPS overall and current fight for anything really, and especially since you have to do so much pre-popping in between or at the start of fights on a Frost DK just to deal the same amount of damage as other classes. They're going to be able to use their talents a little bit later on. But yeah, I gotta say, that sums up this little video for my top 5 problems for Frost DK here on the alpha. Now, or beta at the moment. Yeah, it's the beta. So those are going to be my top 5 problems for beta at the moment. I'll go ahead and think about some of this stuff a little more. So let me know down in the comments below if you have any major issues or any major thoughts for Frost DKs on the alpha that you'd like to either change, or you'd like, or you currently believe that this is a problem. I want to hear your guys' opinion about it. I want to hear what your major ideas are about it. And of course, subscribe if you want some more Frost DK or just DK commentary. No, DK. God, what's that word I am looking for? Just DK stuff in general, I guess. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video. And until next time, this was your boy Hazzed.